We're going to introduce our panel discussion. First, we're going to be moderated by Kaylee Ober from Refugees International, and our panelists are going to be Judy Dorsey from the Brendle Group and our CMMR Group's Leadership Committee as well, Natalie El-Deiry from the International Rescue Committee, and Sherwin Das from Energy Peace Partners. So, Kaylee, if you'd like to take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick, for inviting me. So originally, Patrick asked me if I'd like to be a part of the panel, and I demurred simply because Refugees International is much more focused on kind of the international scope of climate change, migration, and displacement issues. And these are three experts that I think could be better placed to speak about kind of the U.S. context. And I think, this is especially important now that we have hopefully a new administration shortly. And I think there's really scope to grow this conversation a bit more. So one of the challenges of me moderating today is I haven't been privy to your past conversations, and I don't normally know how they go. So I'm gonna take a leap of faith and guess that you all haven't had a chance to discuss the transition to a new administration, and maybe using that as kind of a first question. And so I'll just give you a brief outline or scope of what how I'm moderating this discussion. What I'd like to do is ask each presenter kind of one broad question based on their expertise and background, and then transition that into kind of a more informal Q&A. So, keep your ears open, your minds open, and open to Q&A very shortly. So I think the first question, as I said before, will just focus more on kind of US role with the Biden administration, and also like a chance to re-engage in multilateralism when it comes to climate change, migration, and displacement issues, right? And so I wanted to actually turn first to Sherwin about that, because Sherwin is now with Energy Peace Partners, but he actually has an illustrious career with the UN, including UNDP and UN peacekeeping operations. So I thought Sherwin might be best placed to kind of touch on this subject first. And so Sherwin, open-ended question to you. In what ways can the U.S. re-engage in this conversation and in multilateralism in general when it comes to climate migration and displacement issues? And what role does the UN have to play in that conversation?
Great, thanks, Kaylee. So actually, my background is similar to yours, or what you do, working in the international space. So I'll sort of speak from that vantage point. Maybe a little bit of background about myself. You mentioned a little bit, and Energy Peace Partners. We work, and I'll talk about this more. We work at a kind of a unique intersection. We work at the intersection of renewable energy and peace building in particular. So very briefly, we observed that the countries that are most affected by conflict are also the most climate vulnerable, as many of you know. And we also observed that they're quite low in a number of indicators, but they also happen to be these conflict and climate affected countries, some of the least electrified countries in the world. And we observed that the renewable energy revolution is reaching into many corners of the world, but it's really passing these regions and these states by. And so our work has focused on what we can do to really catalyze renewable energy investment and development in this group of states. So we have a couple of areas of work, and one of those areas of work, and I'm kind of getting to your question in a roundabout way. We have a couple of areas of work, and one of those is working with our colleagues in the United Nations to transition their footprints in the field from diesel reliance to renewables. So many crisis settings, if you take countries like Somalia, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, Central African Republic, they are countries that are going through some kind of a humanitarian or political crisis. And so these missions deploy women and men and material and diesel generators because they're deploying to countries with poor or weak energy infrastructure, and they need to power their operations. So one of the interesting things about American engagement with the United Nations over these last 4 years is cutting budgetary resources for peacekeeping operations. So that has had advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are that it has forced the UN Secretariat to figure out how to do more with less. And in that scenario, you have to figure out, you have to look at energy and your energy footprints and how perhaps switching to renewables, if you can find a way to do that, is actually doing more with less. So on one hand, because the current way that these field missions are designed is a kind of a procure and provide model, because their mission mandates are renewed every year. So some peacekeeping operations have been in place for 10 years, but procure, diesel, and provide is kind of reflective of the path dependency. And having actually less resources forces you to think a little bit more creatively. So that's actually been perhaps one of the positives of the last couple of years in terms of UN administration engagement, if there is a positive in that sense. But I think an incoming Biden administration really open up a host of possibilities in helping the United Nations both get the resources to think about modernizing their operations for the future in terms of energy, so they can be sort of fit and designed for future operations. And I think one of the important things that the Biden administration can hook onto, at least in terms of the work that we're doing, is that the UN Secretary General about a year ago made a commitment, the first commitment that UN leadership has ever made around renewable energy. And it kind of follows trends that we've seen among nations and corporates. So the commitment was that the UN Secretariat, which includes all peacekeeping operations, and most of the UN systems, the entire UN system's carbon footprint comes from its peacekeeping operations deployed in countries with no infrastructure. The commitment was that the UN Secretariat, which includes these operations, would transition to being sourcing 40% of its electricity from renewables by 2025 and 80% by 2030. That is a huge and ambitious target. And I think the new Biden administration would be able to take a number of steps in order to support and create the conditions for that to happen.
Thank you, Sherwin. I realized I was throwing you into the deep end there, but I have to say that you went full circle and did a great job of connecting the dots. And just to follow up on that, not only has the UN Secretariat pledged to green the UN, the whole UN, but UNHCR also has declared this year or just last year that they're releasing a climate action framework. And part of that climate action framework is greening operations. But another part of it is engaging with kind of legal and normative standards for international protection based on climate-related displacement. So, another potential opportunity for a Biden administration to re-engage and be a leader on kind of a hot topic, or at least a much debated topic. And just earlier in October, the UNHCR released a legal considerations paper that really lays out kind of a way forward or path forward for the 1951 Refugee Convention, which doesn't mention climate change, to be used within a climate change context. So that's just a side note for Sherwin's work, and then the potentialities about UN and kind of international multilateral frameworks. And so I think that was a good starting point, because it frames the conversation in one way, and it's that the US has a role to play when it comes to, I think, one, mitigation, right? Being responsible and having re-engaging with the Paris Agreement, and understanding that, their role in past emissions leading to climate-related impacts, right? That could lead to displacement. But then also, now we should talk about what climate-related impacts exist and how they transition to actually kind of displacement or migration outcomes. And so that means I'll turn to both Judy and Natalie a little bit for that. I think I'll start with Judy, because her group, the Brendle Group, just recently released a white paper about international climate migration. What can US communities do? So kind of bringing it from the international level to more US communities. And so I would love to turn to Judy to just reflect a little bit on that paper for those who haven't read it, and kind of give us the recommendations from that paper and lead us through that discussion a little bit.
Sure, great. Thanks, Kaylee. It's interesting because the white paper was released about the same time that the GAO came out to say that there wasn't good federal leadership on climate migration. And so at the time that the paper was released, it was picked up, the white paper was released, it was picked up by Bloomberg asking like, what is going on and could we have a better response with federal leadership? So if I can, I'm just sort of circling back a little bit to your question about the Biden administration, because Biden, before Trump, Obama did also acknowledge this relationship between climate change and international migration and the importance of studying this from an international and then to a perspective of local impact. But in terms of, for this audience, I think I would like to maybe start with some key trends and facts to put this in perspective from a US lens. And that is looking at other major mass migrations that we've experienced in our country and how has that changed our land use planning and other things. And so I think harken back to the Dust Bowl, 1930s, 2.5 million people. And then when we think about African-American history and the Great Migration, 6 million people over a longer time frame, like say 1916 to 1970. What we're expecting within the US from climate migration is about twice the Great Migration in half the amount of time. In the next 20 years, roughly 13 million people within the US migrating due to climate change. Estimated 1 out of 12 people in the South moving northward to California, the Intermountain region, and the Pacific Northwest. And so that's pretty daunting when we think about this. And as I've been working with the CMMR convening group and all of you who are here joining us today, clearly this is a really, really hot topic in the US, climate migration, just by the strong level of interest and growing numbers of people following this topic. And then if you take that 13 million people within the US and you look at it globally, it's 200 million people by mid-century that will be migrating due to climate change. And mostly these people will be migrating from sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central America. So tying it back to Sherwin's work is super important for us to be thinking about this intersection between energy poverty, energy security, and peacekeeping. And the two main takeaways that I've come to, and I come at this after 25 years in US climate action, and then taking a 1-year sabbatical to study international climate migration, culminating in this white paper. The two main things I feel we need are mitigation by itself, or you can call it climate resiliency, like comprehensive US climate action, integrated mitigation, adaptation, resiliency, equity. Think of the highest performing US cities around climate action. That is not enough. We have to combine that with immigration reform and foreign aid. And so that's why I'm super thrilled to be here with our two other panelists, because I come from that climate action perspective, and so do most of us here on this call. And so thrilled to be introducing you to these colleagues that I met through my sabbatical on immigration reform and foreign aid. And then the other thing I just would like to say about climate migration clearly is a huge issue around climate justice. And just as we are coming to reconcile what we've been doing in land use planning as an equity and justice issue, I've actually come to this place realizing I've been part of this problem, even in how we do greenhouse gas accounting and resiliency planning, because we do all of our climate action in the US in these bubbles and expecting that these bubbles will all add up to mid-century decarbonization, but we are not accounting for the disproportionate impacts of our emissions on these communities that Sherwin is trying to serve in the hardest hit regions of our country, of our world, excuse me. So anyway, that's sort of the some of the findings in the white paper. We're just very introductory, trying to lay this landscape, tee up these issues, but really empower US cities with building off of their successes in climate action and their successes in immigration and refugee resettlement, and starting to marry and integrate those efforts.
Thanks, Judy. Actually, this discussion is really interesting, talking from like a city or state perspective about kind of policy development and ways forward. I mean, as we know, at the federal level, it's been difficult to kind of implement broad stroke kind of climate mitigations or resiliency efforts, and it's really been driven by state level and even city level action. And so that's why it's interesting to turn to Natalie and her work at IRC. So I'm going to give the floor to Natalie, and I think like two broad questions. One is, in what ways is IRC already engaging with kind of climate change, and how does it see it affecting its work? And then the other, since she's based out of the Salt Lake City offices, how, is that applicable to her work with resettlement and efforts at the city level?
Thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about our work at the International Rescue Committee. As Kaylee and Judy had mentioned, I am the executive director of our Salt Lake City office. And so my work is focused stateside, a little bit different perspective there. But overall, the International Rescue Committee is a humanitarian aid organization, and we work all over the world in 40 different countries, and then across the United States in 25 offices in 15 states. That being said, there is quite a bit of work when it comes to humanitarian response and response to natural disasters as it relates to climate change. But I can't say that we have really prioritized climate action as something that we have really kind of held on to as a pillar of our work. We are undergoing what we're calling Strategy 100, which is the next iteration of our strategic planning phase that will take us into our 100-year anniversary in about 15 years. And climate action is now becoming one of the pillars of our conversation and how we're integrating that work, both in our overseas work, how our what our organizational mandate will be, and then how that translates into our local work with refugee resettlement, both in a policy advocacy and in a programmatic standpoint. It's really interesting to say that because of all of the incredible work that I hear happening through organizations like Sherwin and others on the international side, that for international organizations such as ours to just be one step behind is telling of kind of where we've been in our response, but not necessarily as forward thinking as we should be. Shifting to the U.S. side of things, with the refugee resettlement program, this is a program that it runs across our country, and it's where the IRC, along with 8 other agencies, are authorized to resettle refugees through the Department of State. And with the resettlement program, the definition of refugee is very much defined by the 1951 convention that Kaylee had mentioned, where it's a person who has fled their country due to a well-founded fear of persecution. That does not include fleeing due to economic hardship, climate, migration, natural disasters, and so on. But one thing that we've really focused in on is the notion of mixed migration. And so oftentimes there are a lot of different factors that are forcing people to flee their countries of origin. And what does that look like? And how are we classifying or incorporating all of that into how a refugee is defined and what that will translate into in terms of the refugee resettlement program? I think under the Biden administration, and as we're expanding this conversation, there is the opportunity to engage in more kind of leadership around broadening that definition of refugee, so that those who are fleeing natural disasters are then eligible for traditional refugee resettlement programs like we have in the United States, where they can come to the U.S., have a pathway to permanency, to U.S. citizenship, and begin to fully integrate into their lives here in the United States. And that's where our work in Salt Lake City comes in. Where we work with around 2,000 individuals beyond just the refugee resettlement program, but provide wraparound services to new American community members, both refugees and other immigrant populations. And I think that there is a great benefit to having partnerships and programming that can serve immigrants in a broader form, regardless of what their pathway has been into the United States, including climate migration. Judy and I have had some really interesting conversations conversations around what that potentially could look like in terms of further displacement in the United States as people need to migrate from areas where natural disasters are so prevalent and into to safer areas of the country, and that notion of resettlement again, of having to reclaim your life once again into another community. So I think that there is a lot of work for us to do in this space, and I will just pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Always great to hear from practitioners on the ground. I think that's kind of part of the conversation that's missing often in these sorts of panels. So that's really great. You know, and I think that there's a lot of food for thought here. Obviously, it's a broad-ranging discussion, and so I'm happy to kick it to all of you all to ask any questions that you might have on your mind after you know, Sherwin, Judy, and Natalie's inputs.
Yeah, so thank you so much. I'm sure there's a lot of people with questions, so please feel free to ask.
Hi, I have a question. My name is Nicole Bates-Seamer. I'm doing a PhD in political science at the University of Victoria in Canada on the intersections between climate change and migration. And this question is more for Judy, but I came to the topic kind of from a climate activist perspective, but what I realized very quickly is that the assumption that climate migration or the discourse or the discussion around it will drive progressive climate policy has not played out. What's playing out is restrictive border and migration policies. And so migration scholars are very critical of these estimates of 200 million or I mean, they've ranged from 50 million to there was one last month about 1 billion, I think, of people, because it's surrounded by this narrative that these are people coming from global south to global north. And I'm wondering how, Judy, you encountered that in your report and how you struggled with that, because that's something that I'm kind of trying to navigate, accounting for what we know from migration scholarship, that migration decisions are very complex, they're very specific to a certain context, and that making estimates of global flows is actually really problematic for what it prioritizes in terms of what our policy responses are. Can you just speak to?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It is very difficult, as you're indicating, to estimate these migration numbers. The 200 million, though, is becoming a consensus in the literature, as you probably have seen. And yes, it does range from smaller to up to 1 billion people. And Sherwin could probably also comment on this around the number of people on our planet who are considered to be energy insecure and therefore, you know, vulnerable towards migration. So that's first and foremost acknowledging that point. And also very much have run into what you're experiencing with sort of the national security paradigm. And I, like you, also come from a climate perspective, and I'm not an expert in national security, but I know that CMMR had previously had Todd Miller on, and he was the author of Storming the Wall. And what really struck me, there were like 4 books that influenced my thinking on this topic, and his was one of them, because I feel like we as practitioners, and no disrespect to researchers, need to be helping to create an alternative narrative to militarization. And that therein lies what we're trying to intersect are the US cities that are working proactively and showing the positive benefits of both climate action and being welcoming communities. And that sometimes we may think of research then driving practice and kind of in this sort of sequence, but maybe there's ways for this to be bi-directional and transdisciplinary in order to, I feel like there's such urgency in this topic that I'm afraid that we may get lost in the numbers and not get to action quick enough. So the idea of the white paper is just to tee up a conceptual framework that provides a different narrative it's like anything, like when you think about, like, not to digress, but like the movie, The Social Dilemma, or drones, or take anything new to our society. There's good outcomes, there's bad outcomes, and we have to be really, really deliberate and intentional around navigating toward those good outcomes. I don't know if that answers, Nicole, your question, but that's some of the rationale and thinking that I brought to framing up this white paper.
Yeah, great, thank you.
This is Blake Gentry. I would like to comment on what I understand. I haven't had the white paper. I'm now downloading it. And I work in an immigrant shelter in Tucson, Arizona, and I've been working in that shelter since 2014. And we have done research in the shelter with the International Mayan League, which is located in Washington, D.C., and in Guatemala. I also am part of a health training program for Quechua Maya in Petén, Guatemala, which is lowlands Guatemala. And typically in northern Guatemala, the hurricane season affects people both in the lowlands and in the highlands, those that are Atlantic storms and then those that are Pacific storms. And there has already been refugees coming because of that, and there are because of the dry corridor. The research that was carried out in our shelter showed that about 30% of those who were coming, one of the major factors was climate change. And inextricably tied with that is plantation agriculture promoted by the United States, fueled by Central America Free Trade Agreement, where we have large displacements of indigenous peoples because of land use. So the land use issue academically is often treated in the climate literature as a process of needing to understand carbon sinks and so on and so forth. But at the political level in Central America, and certainly Honduras would be similar to this, we see direct displacement because of agro-export policies, and the distinction between immigrants and refugees, we might say, is a quaint one. I've been working with Central Americans since the 1980s. And back then we pushed for a designation of refugees, which the United States government never gave them, but it's the same people coming. And the climate impacts, even in the region I live in, which is the border, which is the Sonoran Desert region, also impacts immigration because we have high numbers of people dying in the desert, trying to enter the United States for the various reasons they come. The little study we did, and then I'll be quiet. The little study we did, I would say, was confirmed by a World Food Program study in which they interviewed initially immigrants who had already immigrated, and then they went to Central America and they did focus groups from the areas that those immigrants came from to try to drill down to see what were the particular impacts that they saw. And this is, again, in reference to the dry corridor, but that study, I think, is very substantial and so far somewhat ignored outside of the migration literature. So I would just suggest that there's very little possibility of the United States changing its national security model in terms of the border. It's very hard baked in there. The shelter that I work at, we deal with immigrants who have come through that. We're very familiar with the detention industry and so on and so forth. And all of that is something that the Vice President-elect or the new President-elect was a part of under the Obama administration, and I'm sorry to say that I don't see the possibility of much change of that framework. We don't have political enlightenment, which translates into identifying people coming from the dry corridor and therefore, need any other kind of designation. Frankly, we've been fighting for a long time just to get the designation of people who speak indigenous languages, recognize that they speak indigenous languages and not forced to sign papers in English for their own deportation, which is what's going on right now. So I work in this area, but I also am with the Higher Ground Foundation out of London, specializing in indigenous language and indigenous community adaptation. So I applaud all of the work that's being done here. And I would just say, if there's a way to collaborate in the future, particularly in this region, and particularly for these folks coming, I think it's important to get grounded, as Judy was talking about, and as Natalie was alluding to, in terms of the distinction between immigrants and refugees, because we don't see it. And frankly, the United Nations has also failed us. They send representatives from UNICEF to the border. They tour different shelters and they leave. They're not upholding mandates of the UN for indigenous rights. And they don't even look into the question of migration of people for climate purposes. So I'm sorry to be a wet rag, but I would like to in the future be in touch with people. If there's something that we could do or the information that we have that could be useful, we would appreciate it. We are now in the throes of bracing for another neoliberal administration to come in and facing the same kind of thing that we did previously, which is a deportation of 2 million people under a liberal administration, let alone the one we're dealing with right now, which has completely shut down asylum. And there's no processing of anybody except for deportation, including sterilized women who have already been deported as of the last 48 hours.
Well, that's a lot, Blake. And I just first want to thank you for the work that you're doing. And it is hard for all of us to hear that. These are very, very difficult things to hear. And it's in part hearing stories that you're sharing with us that led me even into this intersection of climate action and migration. So as daunting as this may feel to you, know that you are making a difference to people like me who are, and others who are taking up this cause. One of the other books that struck me as I was getting into this, besides Storming the Wall, is Facilitating the Resettlement and Rights of Climate Refugees, an Argument for Developing Existing Principles and Practices. These are two French researchers. And I know, I don't mean in any way to undermine the work that you've been doing for decades, trying to bring that to fruition in our southern border, but maybe looking elsewhere internationally for where we are getting some momentum could be part of something to discuss. I know Natalie and probably has a lot to say about that. And then the other thing that struck me is sometimes we have to get scrappy with our practitioner partners. We do address the dry corridor in the white paper. And here in Colorado, we have Trees, Water, People, which is a nonprofit doing work in the dry corridor. And it reminds me, and we have been in discussions about climate migration. And I just wanted to share with the audience that whether on this path to positive, if you will, versus these alternatives, our first thing we all know is really good support and resiliency in place, including supporting agricultural economies to try and reduce the number of people that would need to be migrating. And the ProPublica research really supports this as well, mitigation and good resiliency efforts. So to the extent that we're proactive about resiliency, that reduces the demand. So those are some of my first reactions. I wasn't sure if there was a particular question so much as really sharing the reality that you're experiencing. It is heartbreaking for us as professionals to be hearing what you're experiencing on the front line. So thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome. And the question is, how can we get the migration people on the ground, not just writing papers, and I write papers too, but the people on the ground involved with those who are advocating for climate policies, particularly in the challenge that we have in the United States in the next 3 months. Because if this kind of information doesn't go into the statements that a new administration is using to consider what the policies will be after they're in office, it's usually too late. So I thank you for the work that you've done and for that paper and for the work of the other panelists here. And don't mean to dominate this, but if there is a way to keep open communications in the future, we would like to do that, frankly, because we're extremely isolated on the border. The reporting is only done ad hoc and as a response to a headline that's already established, not the usual kind of stuff. There was a conference on migration in Central America and climate and migration in Central America and Mexico at the University of Arizona last spring. And I don't know if those summaries have ever been put out, but those scholars were looking at multiple factors of migration, climate being one. They were kind of downplaying climate per se, because they didn't want border policies to start becoming anti-immigrant, anti-climate immigrant, or anti-climate refugee policies. So there's a lot of angles to look at in terms of this issue. So thank you all, and I hope that there's a way to have an exchange in the future.
And Blake, I'm going to jump in really quickly. Thank you for your comments. And we've developed a decent sized network here. And if you want to, what I can do is try to distribute some of this to our network, which has some people that might be placed to help with some of the things you're talking about. So if you want to contact me directly, I'll give you my email. And if there's any source materials or things like that you want me to distribute, I'd be more than happy to do that.
And Kaylee, as our moderator, and looking at the time, if I could, I would like to kind of highlight some work that Natalie and Sherwin are doing that might address Blake's question, like what can we be doing in this? And when I earlier said I feel like our greenhouse gas accounting is broken, let's say Tucson's doing a sustainability plan or climate action plan, or any city, USA. One of the things that Sherwin is working on are peace recs, whereby we can be looking at, if we think about this ratio of what any city's contribution is to climate change against the harm that's being done elsewhere, peace recs are a financial instrument that can help then direct dollars into some of those efforts in the hardest hit places, to be recognizing some of our kind of reconciling some of our culpability in the in those regions. And then when I think about IRC and the work that Natalie's doing, resettling refugees in Salt Lake City, for example, the idea with these US cities is to get climate action practitioners. So Salt Lake City has a climate action plan. They could start to get groups together to start talking more deliberately around climate migration, and bringing Natalie and others to the table and helping build better and more clear bridges between refugee resettlement within communities and climate action within communities.
Natalie, did you want to engage with that for a moment?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Just to comment on Blake's point too, I think it is a really hard place for us all. IRC is doing a lot of work along the border, and what I was kind of referring to in terms of mixed migration status is, is that it holds one person, as more deserving of services or a path into safety than other, whether you're a refugee or you fled, abuse from a spouse or economic hardships or whatever the reason is. And I think it is a really difficult space for us as practitioners to be bound by these different funding sources, really is what it comes down to in terms of how we're able to serve certain people and certain sects of society, especially when it comes to immigrant populations, and not serve others. But it doesn't make one population more deserving than any other. It's just it's checking boxes, and that is a very difficult place. With regard to the climate action plan in Salt Lake City, we are starting some of that work, very nascent, and it is difficult, again, from the practitioner level to not be included in those conversations from the beginning, because the sector of our community or the people that we're serving are such a small piece of the puzzle. But we are starting to see more, as we're talking about equity in our communities, more conversations driving in that way, where our Office of Sustainability and our Office of the Climate Action Network and the folks that are here locally to do active outreach into refugee and immigrant communities, especially around land use right now, which has been quite inspiring, because it is so often the folks with means who have time to participate in some of these conversations, or have certain academic or professional networks, that there has been more strategic outreach into refugee and immigrant communities, and we're helping to broker and foster some of those conversations. And so it takes time, and it takes a visibility, and it takes creating a welcoming and receptive environment, and to meet people where they're at, to really engage and get to that conversation flowing in a two-way street, not from me, but from the people that I serve, that their voices need to be heard as we're talking about climate action and sustainability overall. And these little seeds are just starting to be being planted now, that I hope will flower and blossom as time goes on. But I am hopeful, with some of the steps that Salt Lake City is taking, that we'll see more of that going down the pathway.
And Sherwin, any comment on what Judy or Natalie is talking about before we take some more questions? You're still on mute.
I think our work, Judy's familiar with our work to develop a financing instrument effectively for stimulating renewable energy development in fragile states. And that's really linked, I think, to this conversation in terms of enhancing capacity and resiliency in these communities that are climate affected and conflict affected. I mean, I don't think I need to go into the details of how we developed and piloted this instrument, but I think what we've observed, I think, is that in the corporate space, many companies that have sustainability targets and renewable energy targets are thinking more about climate equity. And I think our work in trying to unlock investment in renewable energy, which is a form of climate finance that is typically geared towards the largest polluters than the countries that are most affected. I think we are uncovering a group of companies that are thinking about climate equity in the United States and worldwide much more. And so their corporate decisions around sustainability and around how they procure renewable energy are now kind of framed through this climate equity lens. And I think that's an important development that bodes well for all of our collective work.
Sherwin. Obviously, like climate change adaptation and resilience is part and parcel of this conversation. Obviously, it determines vulnerability and ability, the agency to choose whether you move or not, right? Or if you end up being forcibly displaced. And so that is definitely a part of the conversation that we need to keep on the agenda. And just Blake, so you know, so it also opens up scope for more conversation, I think, as Judy was alluding to, right? So like a Biden administration is very vocal about climate change. In fact, all the calls that Biden has had with world leaders have all touched on climate change. If you look at Biden's online plan, he actually acknowledges climate change as a driver of migration, which is really novel. And so there may be scope to push him from a climate angle in ways that maybe a traditional kind of asylum or migration angle might not gain as much traction. And so that's something that, you know, practitioners on the ground need to plug into, and that advocacy spaces need to start organizing around so it's productive. Do people have other questions? I know we have about 8 minutes left.
I actually do have a question if I can jump in. This is a new space for me, but I was thinking in terms of national security, assuming the Biden administration will reinstate climate change as a national security priority, I wonder if there's room to adapt to the language of those, of the national security strategy to make sure that what's being securitized is the climate change drivers of migration and not migration or migrants themselves. Because the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act actually took language from from the 2015 strategy in the bill. And so I think there's some room for, you know, being really careful about the language in the executive branch trickling down and affecting policies, you know, from that point. But I was hoping that maybe someone with more experience in this field could provide some feedback on that idea.
Any takers from the speakers? If not, I can speak to it a little bit after you, Sherwin.
I mean, I can't speak to that directly, but in terms of the federal government, but what I can say is that when you look at the United Nations Security Council, which is responsible for international peace and security, has generally been reluctant to talk about climate change and to include climate change references in the mandates for peacekeeping operations. But that began to change in 2017 and 2018, where you began to see references to climate change in the mandate of the Somalia mission. And the fact is that 8 out of the 10, I think, largest peacekeeping operations deployed in the world are deployed in highly climate vulnerable countries. And I think the Security Council has always considered climate change as an issue for the General Assembly and not as an issue for the Council, which deals with sort of traditional threats. But you're seeing the language included in more and more peacekeeping operation mandates. And because you've effectively had an American administration that's happened in the context of an American administration that's been largely absent when it comes to issues of climate change, including in the Security Council. So I think one of the changes we'll see in the Security Council is much more emphasis on the link between climate and security, and much more language around climate change in Security Council mission mandates. So I think that's important on the international stage.
Yeah, and it's part of, I guess, Cameron's question, which is we kind of already understand the language in which the security community speaks around this issue. It's about threat multipliers, it's about instability and risk. And so the question is, how does that translate then to the way that they frame migrants within some of the products that they write or that are released, and how does that play out in policy? If you look at Biden's administration transition team, Sharon Burke is on that team. So she ran the Environment and Natural Resources program at Center for New American Security. She's now at New America. But I think it's identifying people who are well-versed in this subject and ensuring that, they're kept up to date with the way in which we discuss this issue so that they are able to be that interlocutor in these kinds of conversations and to really carry it forward in a productive way. Because, you and I aren't going to be in that conversation, but if you have, you map out the links to that, we might be able to kind of change the way in which they frame things. So it's not all about kind of the threat of migrants or the threat of instability, right?
Can I make a comment?
Sure, really briefly. We have about 3 minutes.
Okay, I think the challenge will be for climate advocacy to assert the rights of migration. I think from a border perspective, trying to change the arc of the national security model of the United States is not going to work. The justification for border militarization has been after 9/11, the threat of terrorism. There were no terrorists before 9/11. There haven't been any since then. There are more terrorists who've been arrested in the state of Minnesota than there have on the entire US border, northern or southern. So for us, the national security model is a canard and is just used to continue funding more and more technology, as Todd Miller in his book has put out there. But I think there is an opening in the administration for discussion about the rights of climate migrants. And I think that's probably the more fruitful place. I'm just very skeptical that we're going to change the ideas of this administration coming in, which previously thought they're going to solve the problem by sending some security money package to Central America to train the police to better, help their people who are fleeing violence, for example. That was what they did under the Obama administration for Guatemala. So I think there's an opening, and I would applaud any attempt to do that.
All right, well, thank you guys so much. Thank you, Kaylee, for moderating this panel. It's been amazing. Thank you, Natalie, Sherwin, and Judy for your insights. I think one thing we're going to take away from this is that the issue of climate migration is such an incredibly wide-ranging topic. You could talk for days about it in every single permutation, almost every single issue and facet of life. I'm glad we're having so much discussion and thought about how to address it in our own ways. And I'm very grateful to each and every one of you for taking the time to talk to us. So we have about 1 minute, and I want to thank everyone who's attended. Thank you very much for your time and for putting up with our technical issues. I'm glad so many people got to join us. We will be having our next a webinar at a regularly scheduled time, first Tuesday of the month in December, and we're working on a couple of topics right now. Once we finalize them, we'll let you know, but one thing's for sure, they will be interesting. So thanks again for your time. Have a great day, and we'll be in touch soon.